the serial killer Tsutomu Miyazaki. The music video for Alien Ant Farm's cover of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal, and the Guinness World Record for the longest development time of any video game. What connects these things? Final Fantasy XII. Released on the PlayStation 2 March 16, 2006 in Japan and October 31, 2006 in North America, Final Fantasy XII is the first single-player Final Fantasy to have no involvement from the series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi. For this video, I will be focused on the Zodiac Age version of the game for the PlayStation 4, released worldwide July 11, 2017, and in Japan July 13, 2 days later. The reason being that the Zodiac version lets you speed the combat up by 4 times, and since I beat the original PS2 version 10 years ago, I have nothing to prove. When relevant, I will highlight differences, but for the most part, the Zodiac version is the one to play, unless you're stuck in a hyperbolic time chamber.
Spending an entire year in the hyperbolic time chamber was the most difficult task I've ever had to face. The gravity was so intense I could barely walk, the air was so thick I could hardly breathe, and the temperature fluctuated wildly, sometimes freezing cold, and others raging hot. Every day presented its own hardship, a new obstacle to be met and overcome. Of course, some days were harder than others.
I've been excited to revisit this Final Fantasy to answer 2 main questions. The first being, since I did not enjoy the game on the PS2, does the Zodiac Age version improve the experience enough to change my overall opinion of the game? The second question, informed now through my many-year process of playing the Yasumi Matsuno directed games preceding this, Matsuno being the original director of Final Fantasy XII, we'll get to that later, could I crack the case on the troubled development of this game that has gone down in infamy among many Final Fantasy fans as the game that broke the proverbial camel's back?
Break the code, solve the crime.
The code, solve the crime.
Keep watching to find out.
I'm afraid the jury's still out on that one.
I've never felt more conflicted about a game than I have for Final Fantasy XII. Like those experiments on the corpus callosum split epileptics where one side of their brain didn't have access to the reasons to logically explain the question they were being asked and yet still confidently answered, I too feel like I'm guilty of shouting my knowledge of the prolonged development, Barry's interview comments from the staff, and Matsuno's untimely departure as if those are the reasons why this game doesn't work for me. Those factors may have contributed to the final product, but let's look at the story, gameplay, and music, then try to separate the behind-the-scenes drama from the game we got. Development history. In doing my research of the development of Final Fantasy XII, I've tried my best to push past the rumors and get to the facts. Even among published interviews of its development staff, there are inconsistencies that are hard to square. Soft. And more noticeably, the exit of its original director and this YouTube channel's most favorite creator, Yasumi Matsuno, only spurred on more speculation about its tumultuous journey to see the light of day due to the state of Square Enix, the developer and publisher of Final Fantasy XII. But let's back up a bit and see where Square was when the game was first put into production. Wikipedia alleges the game started development December 2000, and yet with newly translated information from the Final Fantasy XII Scenario Ultimania, credit halmarut translations, the earliest indications of development seem to point to January 2001 with Hideo Minaba, art director, and Akihiko Yoshida, main character designer, both citing that date as their start date with the project. This month difference doesn't affect our timeline though. This is where Square seemed invincible. Sure, Final Fantasy IX didn't sell as well as 7 or 8, but 10 was about to be released in a few months on the exciting new hardware. And development was already done on Square's first foray into the MMO space with Final Fantasy XI. Square was so big, they even had a movie coming out with Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, in the summer of 2001. What could go wrong? It's been the accepted lore of Square Enix that the box office bomb of The Spirits Within is what put Square in the financially precarious position to where they needed to merge with Enix, but more recent information and examination has shown that Square and Enix, best known for their Dragon Quest series, were already in talks to merge before the box office debacle, and that the financial setback only delayed the process. Sakaguchi and the then president of Square, Tomoyuki Takechi, resigned due to the company's first deficit, with the reasons being cited being the movie and delaying Final Fantasy X. These events took place in January 2001, before The Spirits Within came out. Sakaguchi was still signed on after his resignation to remain as an executive producer, and one can imagine that he was hoping the eventual success of Final Fantasy X and The Spirits Within would buoy him back to the throne. Well, at least one of those things was successful. Whether it was the delay of Final Fantasy X, the failure of The Spirits Within, or if Sakaguchi is to be believed that he was simply tired of the administrative position he was in, the result was that the creative direction of Final Fantasy would no longer be shaped by its creator. The seeds for this can be seen with the splitting of the teams working on the mainline Final Fantasies prior to this, but this represented a much larger shift. Interesting side note, did you know that Sakaguchi may have registered the website for Mistwalker as early as May 14, 2001? Yuichi Wada, an executive who joined Square only a year previously in 2000 as CFO, took the position of CEO and president of Square. Wada has become a boogeyman for some, for milking the Final Fantasy franchise and initiating sequels against the original vision of Sakaguchi, who wanted each Final Fantasy to be a standalone, shoot-for-the-moon title. And it's hard to see slides like this and not picture Yuichi Wada rubbing his hands together with fire in his eyes. And yet, Yuichi Wada might also be responsible for Square surviving as Square Enix by proving the company could be profitable at the expense of creative scruples. You have Yasumi Matsuno taking on this project after Vagrant Story at Sakaguchi's behest, only for the whole company to get shuffled and flipped upside down around him. Sakaguchi, his mentor, is exiled to Hawaii while he's put in charge of the company's flagship series. Pressure much? Before we try to set up a timeline for Matsuno's departure, let's look at the other key players in Final Fantasy XII's development. When the game was announced, the other important name attached was Hiroyuki Ito, creator of the ATB, Active Time Battle, system, who worked with Matsuno on Final Fantasy Tactics systems. He would go on to be credited as the director of the PS2 version along with Hiroshi Minagawa, originally the graphics and real-time visual director before ultimately taking over as co-director after Matsuno bowed out. Minagawa had done the art direction of pretty much every Matsuno title before this, so with the shared history between Ito and Minagawa, it makes sense that they would be the ones to steer this ship when its captain went overboard. In the Zodiac version, Minagawa is listed as director, and Ito is original game design and international director. Other key staff include scenario writer Daisuke Watanabe, who joined the team November 2004 and previous to this project worked on Final Fantasy X, X-2, and Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories as a scenario writer. The Scenario Ultimania has the members interviewed state when they joined the project, and it's this information that I haven't seen or heard discussed before that I think can help us build a likely picture of what may have happened. Jun Akiyama, as event director, joined the team January 2002 and worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and Kingdom Hearts. And, more interesting to me, as the Final Fantasy VII event planner for story elements and cutscenes involving the characters Red 13 and Yuffie, and the snowboarding minigame. Hideo Minaba and Isamu Kamiko-Kuryo as art directors. Minaba worked as the art director of Final Fantasy IX and designed the characters Zidane, Garnet, Vivi, Kuja, and Beatrix. Minaba also worked on Final Fantasy Tactics as an art supervisor. Kimiko-Kuryo started with the background art for Final Fantasy X, but 12 was his first big credit. After 12, he would go on to do the art direction for 13, 13-2, and 15. He also did the character design for a game previously covered on this channel, the Dio Field Chronicle. Akitoshi Kawazu took over as producer on Final Fantasy XII in August 2005 after the original producer and director Yasumi Matsuno had to leave the project due to health problems. And it wouldn't be a Matsuno project unless Hitachi Sakamoto was doing the music. He joined the project June 2003 and was accompanied by sound effect director and Vagrant Story alum Tomohiro Yojima. So now that we know the key players and the state of Square Enix during the period of the longest game development time of any game up until that point, according to the Guinness World Records 2008 Gamers Edition, why did it take so long? And why did Matsuno leave? I'll give you the short version first. The game took so long to make because Final Fantasy XII is a very ambitious game. It's one of the reasons that despite not loving it at all, I do respect the game and what they were trying to do from the gameplay perspective. They wanted to create a JRPG that pushed the medium forward. No more random encounters, an incredible amount of content, real-time combat in a seamless world. They looked at the combat of Final Fantasy XI and took some notes, but keep in mind the complexity of what they were doing on the PS2. Final Fantasy XI didn't have to allocate memory to the AI of up to 3 other companions like Final Fantasy XII did, and they were restricted to the data that was on the disc. They also wanted to have cities and towns that felt like real cities, populated by a believable amount of people. For instance, they completed a version of Rabanastre that was 15 times the final size, but they scaled it back, according to Yoshida in an interview from the Ultimania. Final Fantasy X, in comparison, was much more linear in its design and operated like previous 3D Final Fantasies by utilizing fixed camera angles to minimize the amount of polygons that had to be rendered in real time. 12 having a fully controllable camera didn't have that luxury, so like Vagrant Story before it, they had to be extremely mindful of the processing load on the system. So there's the technological side of the equation for why Final Fantasy XII took so long. But more likely, it's the creative side that makes up the majority of the development woes.
Who could that be? Such a faithful hound to cling so to a falling kingdom.
Better than throwing it away.
Throwing it away, as you threw away our homeland.
In a 2003 interview with Matsuno and Shigeru Miyamoto about Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, thanks Schmublations, Matsuno says this. Matsuno: when I've worked in small groups, it's been with veterans who, how can I put this? There's a certain implicit harmony between us, where if I say we're doing something, they understand the reasons why without any further explanation on my part. When the team gets too big, though, that's not the case. From the developer's point of view, my instructions can seem mean-spirited on the one hand, or completely arbitrary on the other. With big teams, you have more of those difficult handling problems. Miyamoto: that's some real talk. You have Matsuno working on the biggest franchise within Square Enix, leading a team exponentially larger than his previous teams, working on new hardware trying to push not just the series, but JRPGs in general forward, with new systems all during a time within the company where the executives have wrested control from the creative founder of Final Fantasy. His mentor, Sakaguchi, has left the company, unofficially at first, then formally, and poaches a few of Matsuno's staff. The only confirmed one I can find is Hideo Minaba, who left Square in 2004, but is still interviewed in the Ultimania and the Final Fantasy XII bonus disc. Akitoshi Kawazu came on late in the project as a producer, and the reason I include him in the development staff is because of the interesting things he's let slip in interviews. Interviewer: is it true that Final Fantasy XII had to be reworked several times? Kawazu: Final Fantasy XII was an extremely ambitious and rich game. Like a director who has to edit his film because it's too long, there are some passages that had to be removed to make it easier for players to get to grips with, in order to make it better. The development did indeed have some turmoil, because at the beginning the game had gone off in all directions. By trying to do well, we overdid it. Given that the game was originally developed jointly by the Play Online, Square Enix's online gaming service, editor's note, and those of Final Fantasy Tactics, the objectives of these two teams were sometimes divergent. We had a game that developed in a somewhat anarchic way, and in the end we had to put everything back in place since the two teams were going in two different directions. Indeed, because of these problems, we had to refocus and it took a lot of time. This is why I have regrets about the game's storyline, for example. Interviewer: what kind of regrets? Kawazu: when you arrive at the production of a game that is already well underway, you can no longer change the scenario, because the universe is already built, the dialogue's already written. The flow of the game can no longer be retouched either. This is where I am frustrated. because it was impossible to rebalance certain passages in the story that did not suit me. When it comes to gameplay, everything is simpler. You can weaken a boss that is too difficult, lengthen a corridor that is too narrow, in short, make small adjustments to be sure to find a good balance. From this point of view, Final Fantasy XII is in my opinion perfect, insofar as it leaves a large amount of freedom to the player. Interviewer: you've sort of played the role of the firefighter on duty, perhaps to the detriment of the creative aspect. Kawazu: my role was mainly to manage the development teams, remotivate them, and get them all moving in the same direction. Someone had to do it, and that someone was me. But believe me, it's not a job I hate, it's even something I enjoy. Also with IGN UK. Final Fantasy XII is the first game in the series to receive a 40 out of 40 score in Famitsu. What's it like to be involved with something deemed perfect, and how do you improve and go forward from this when you've set such a high standard for yourself? Kawazu: firstly, we're obviously very pleased with the Famitsu score. At the same time, that's the score they gave it, and of course, we were doing everything we could to make the best game possible. We still think it's far from perfect, though. Hearing fan feedback after the game was released in Japan, there were some players who felt that the story wasn't as good as it might have been compared with some of the earlier Final Fantasy games. Even personally, I feel that because of the way the games are made, the story itself is decided very early on, and the process of getting that realized makes it very difficult to change along the way. There are things I would have liked to change about it as well, but practically speaking, we couldn't. From a development standpoint then, that's something we need to address and find a way to work better going forwards. That's just one example, but certainly there are things we can improve on in future titles. Another debated topic about the development is how much the executives forced Matsuno to change his creative vision for the game. The biggest question mark for a long time being whether Vaughn was supposed to be the main character of the game. Matsuno has said on Twitter most recently that Bosch or anyone else being the main character aside from Vaughn is fake news. Well, I guess the confusion here is the rumor Bosch was supposed to be the main character of Final Fantasy XII, shot in the dark here to see what's true. That rumor is a fake story. Thank you. This is backed up by translated Ultimania interviews. What were the initial concepts like? Interviewer: was Bosch originally meant to be a young character when development began? But before we delve into that, please tell us about the time you joined the development of Final Fantasy XII. Manaba: I joined the dev team after the international version of Final Fantasy IX was finished. At first, the team discussed making a small game for play online over a period of 6 months or a year, but before we knew it, it had become Final Fantasy XII. Haha! The character's head and body, and even the decision of whether the game would be online or offline, went through several changes during the development process. Akiko: we had a complete polygon model that is named Bosch for PS2 testing purposes. This Bosch is of different design than what we see in-game. Bosch walked around on the map, but he wasn't an older man as we see today. He was a younger character. By creation date alone, Bosch was the oldest. After Bosch, I designed Vaughn as the first official character. I spent a lot of time working on Vaughn's design before the scenario was finalized, so it took me a long time to complete it. And yet, in a French interview, Minagawa says this. Question: regarding the game's design, Matsuno's departure, and the release requirements, I'd like to know if they're completely satisfied with the final result, or if his ideas, which were really close to his heart, had to be put on hold due to lack of time or resources. Hiroshi Minagawa: like any video game, between the moment you decide on a project and then see the final version of the game, of course, there are always things that change. For Final Fantasy XII, it was like for the other games. There are lots of things that changed. But I'd say there weren't huge transformations compared to what we had planned to do. There were just little things that changed here and there. On the other hand, if you want an example of something that changed a lot, originally Final Fantasy XII wasn't supposed to look so much like Vagrant's story and design. We had rather planned to return to characters with big heads. To also give you an idea of the evolution of the game's atmosphere, the first character we created, who was basically the hero of the story, was Bosch. And finally, the heroes of the final game as we know it today, who are Vaughn and Penelo, were last, and we added them at the end. This could be a simple case of people online taking machine-translated information that's already coming from non-French speakers and misinterpreting it. Minagawa could easily be talking about pre-production concepts of the characters and their roles in the story versus the less likely scenario of them shifting the whole story near the end of production to focus on Vaughn due to Vagrant Story's in his prime protagonist not selling well. The last thing I'll include is another Kawazu quote, IGN UK. We've heard complaints from Western Final Fantasy fans concerning Final Fantasy XII's character design, particularly in regard to the somewhat effeminate nature of Vaughn, the lead. You've noted previously that the decision was made to appeal to a certain Japanese demographic. Have you noticed a significant difference between Eastern and Western audiences? And does that come into consideration during the design process? Kawazu. Certainly. Character design is one of the areas we mull over extensively, and is one of the most difficult things to develop and decide on. When the game was released in Japan, a lot of people actually commented that there seemed to be a lot of Western influences in the game's characters. That said, Vaughn in particular is obviously a little younger than the series is used to, and there are a lot of people on the development team who aren't necessarily feeling like this is the right character. It does kind of clash with the other characters and environments in the game. But traditionally for the Japanese RPG market, you start out with a young, inexperienced character who grows throughout the story, so to an extent, having the lead be this younger, immature character that is underdeveloped is somewhat expected. That doesn't necessarily mean that we as producers and designers always even like that, but certainly concessions must be made to cater for what the markets want. Unless Matsuno does a tell-all after he's retired, it's unlikely we'll ever know the full story. The official story for now is that Matsuno got sick and had to leave a year before release date. Other rumors posit that he had stopped coming to work after Sakaguchi took off for Mistwalker midway into production, and so perhaps it was a Don Draper and Mad Men situation where they put him on leave because they thought he couldn't take the pressure.
We didn't fire him. I would never agree to that.
The leave of absence was a very clear message. We were allowing him to preserve his dignity while seeking other employment.
Or maybe, just maybe, he did just get sick near the end of development, probably contributed by the stress of working on a multi-year intense project, and the timing, though suspicious, means nothing. I think this description in the game for the super boss Yasman gives just a little bit more insight. One deity among dragons, one great worm to rule all worms of the world, by the creator himself created. Legend says it is an anima, guardian to a sacred blade. Though most sacred among its kind, its great power drove it to madness, and in the end, it became a threat to its own creator. His master was killed by Asman, robbing Mont Blanc of all joy in life, and he would have revenge. The good news is that we didn't lose Matsuno for good. The bad news is that I don't love Final Fantasy XII, and so Matsuno's departure has become the convenient scapegoat for me and other people who think that the game doesn't live up to its potential. It's a fascinating failure to me. It doesn't rise to what I think a Final Fantasy game should be, and it doesn't compete with what Matsuno has done in the past. It's easier if I just think of it as a very odd big-budget Vagrant Story spin-off versus a mainline Final Fantasy. And to tackle why I don't love Final Fantasy XII, after all that preamble, I present the story.
The death of Lord Raslaheos Nabradia was but one of many tragedies to befall the kingdom of Dalmasca. The air of hope that had...
The story of Final Fantasy XII has a lot of things going for it. It takes place in Ivalice, the same world that Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story take place, although on the timeline it happens thousands of years earlier. The opening cutscene shows Ivalice in the year 704 Old Valendian, and a royal wedding in the royal city of Rabanastre has even the Mughals shaken it. From the jubilation of matrimony between the two nations in Nabradia's Prince Rassler and Dalmasca's Princess Ashelia, we shift to the War Council room, as news has come that the Arcadian Empire has struck Nabudis. This is where you can really feel the Matsuno hand on the story, as characters impart unfamiliar names without the "as you know" dialogue others JRPGs employ. And already the Star Wars influence can be seen and heard. The airship design and score might not be enough on their own, but as other characters and plot lines come into play, the parallels are overwhelming. The prince we saw at the wedding now heads off to war after rousing his troops. Now at Nalbina Fortress, a full-scale battle is underway with thousands of Humes, the name for humans in this world, and other races in full armor, some atop Chocobo. The mages creating the paling, a magical force field, are struck down. At this point, a knight who is guarding the prince begs retreat, but it is too late.
For my father. For my father! Lord Rasler! Sharpshooter.
An arrow finds its way through the prince's armor, right into his trachea. We see the knight retreat on Chocoback, with the prince laid out limp over his legs as the ship explodes behind him in the battlefield. Then we see the princess in mourning at the prince's funeral. This opening cutscene, when I first played it, had me convinced that I was going to love Final Fantasy XII. The tone, the scale, everything I wanted it to be. A marrying of Final Fantasy Tactics with the mainline series. And right after this opening cutscene, an exposition dump, but done in the same way that Final Fantasy Tactics did, with the narrator recounting the events of the story from a historical document. The action takes place between two great empires in a smaller nation, Dalmasca, that is unfortunate enough to be sandwiched between them. In this case, Arcadia on the east, the one that attacked us, and Rosaria to the west. The newly conquered Nebradia to our north is set as the location for a treaty signing for the King of Dalmasca. The narration states that this treaty is to be writ in royal blood, and with that you take control for the first time in the game as Rex. The knight from the opening, Bosch, greets you at Nalbina Fortress, the treaty signing location. Another soldier beckons them to hurry because the king is in danger. This tutorial section introduces all the basics of combat and movement. You stay to hold back some soldiers and let Bosch go ahead. When you make your way to the top of the fortress, you find a room littered with dead soldiers and the king's lifeless body. Your familiar friend and Captain Bosch stabs Rex and explains his treason by alleging that the king was going to sell Dalmasca to the Empire.
Why? Our king, what have you done?
The king intended all along to sell Dalmasca to the Empire. His Majesty was a traitor.
Captain,
Seize the insurgent. Hello!
Well, so much for peaceful negotiations.
We'll never surrender to you. We are not cattle to be sold by a traitor king.
But the war is over, my dear Captain. You have lost.
Who can you trust? What is true? What is the right way to solve a conflict? If only the rest of the story could have kept focus on these themes. Then we're placed in the shoes of Vaughn, a street urchin who wants to be a sky pirate, and Penelo, his fellow orphan friend. Vaughn is trying to sneak into an Empire fete to steal treasures that he, as a Dalmascan, feels he has a right to. Vaughn finds a way to infiltrate the gala. Whilst stealing the treasure the goddess Magicite from the royal palace, Vaughn is interrupted by Balthier and Fran. They hear a commotion and escape the fortress as it is being attacked by a resistance group. Through the help of Fran's speeder bike, they crash land into the sewer system. The Empire's troops follow them, and as the party avoids capture, they come upon the resistance group responsible for the attack. The resistance group features a familiar face, but we'll save that for the spoiler section. There are a few good twists in the first 10 hours or so, and we'll save those as well for the spoiler section. The rest of the story, unfortunately, doesn't keep up that narrative drive. For those who haven't played the game, I will keep it short and breezy and say it lacks the memorable moments of a Final Fantasy and the teeth of a Matsuno work. The story becomes a kind of globe-trotting adventure, but the motivation behind this travel and the lack of exploration of the characters themselves and places beyond the surface is where the game feels the most unfinished to me. I think the team focused too many resources on the side content, aka hunts, and the scale of the world, at the cost of creating places and scenarios that the player cares about. The world of Final Fantasy XII may lack character, but what about the actual characters of the game?
Quite a performance.
who are you?
I play the leading man. Who else?
Balthier is easily the best character in the game, and yet his backstory is merely hinted at, and even though he's a sky pirate, we see nothing in the game to show that.
Oh? Like a sky pirate that chooses to steal through the sewers.
Pirates? You're sky pirates? So you have an airship?
It's both here.
We never see him shoot a cannon or nothing. Vaughn always says he wants to be a sky pirate, but because of technical reasons, the airships being too complex to render except for CG cutscenes, we never get to control an airship aside from fast travel near the end of the game, which is just cursor-based. Penelo doesn't have much personality to the point that even the marketing team had a hard time trying to describe her in the promotional videos. Fran also seems like a missed opportunity. Aside from creating a new generation of furries and Bjork fans, she doesn't do much for me. There's again a vague backstory implied, and apparently that was done on purpose so the fanbase could dream up their own headcanon. I don't need a lot of character development, but very few of the characters show meaningful progression through the story. Vaughn is actually one of the better characters in this regard, but we'll get to that in the spoiler section. I said earlier Balthier was the best, but I have to give major props to Vayne Solidor, the main antagonist.
We will have order! I give you your new consul, His Imperial Highness Lord Vayne Solidor, Commandant of the Arcadian Empire's Western Arm... Your Excellency!
He's coming into the crowd. Look.
People of Rabanastre, is it with hatred you look upon your consul? With hatred you look upon the Empire?
Spit on your empire! Go back to Arcadia!
There was little point in asking. But know this, I harbor no idle hopes of frustrating that hatred. Nor shall I ask your fealty. That is the due of your fallen king, and rightly so. King Ramanas loved his people, strove to bring you peace. His was a rule worthy of your devotion. Even now, he remains among you, protecting you. His ardor for the peace and weal of Dalmasca falters not. I would ask only that you do your king honor. Together let us embrace the peace His Majesty would surely desire. 2 years now divide us from war's bitter end, yet still its shadow looms over all, stifling the infant peace a pall only you may cast off. Achieve but this one thing, and your hatred of me and of the Empire will grieve me not. I will stand fast. I will endure your hatred, suffer your slings and arrows. I will defend Dalmasca. Here I will pay my debt. I swear it now. Though King Ramanas and Lady Ash be gone, they stand ever at the side of their people. In honoring peace, you do honor to their memory and to Dalmasca. What I ask plain. My hopes now rest with you.
He feels like a clear Matsuno character that gives off Ubermensch in the best way. Charming the common folk of Rabanastre with his long flowing locks and charisma, he is a ruthless politician that is playing the game without morality weighing him down. I've heard people defend Final Fantasy XII's story by claiming that the reason why people don't like it is because it's too complex due to its political nature. I feel the opposite is true. The events of this game focus on a surprisingly few amount of parties. Most of the interesting dynamics are to be found not in our party, but in the antagonists. Vayne Solidor, the judges, the Emperor, and the Senate. Most of the game your party is chasing after Nethicite, the crystals of this Final Fantasy. While the more interesting political intrigue is happening off-screen or in a cutscene that takes place a continent away.
What's that?
It's Nethicite. Manufactured Nethicite.
Nethicite?
Unlike regular magicite, Nethicite absorbs magical energy.
The localization by Alexander O. Smith & Co. does give the game a more mature feel, and I can imagine why some fans of the series found this tone more respectable. Compare 12 to the Final Fantasies before it, the voice acting of 10 per se.
Oh, if I score a goal, I'll, do this.
Or the more primitive, cartoony look of earlier entries. And I could imagine the embarrassment of certain self-conscious, finally post-pubescent gamers when their mom walks in the living room, versus Final Fantasy XII's more respectable affectation. There's nothing wrong with a more mature tone, and that's what I was originally hoping I was in for when I started the game. The tutorial section tricked me in many ways, wink wink, and I think this is one of the few parts of the game where there is enough evidence in interviews to show we had a more developed story in store for us, but much of it had to be sacrificed in order to hit an already overextended deadline. Looking at the reviews at the time, especially Famitsu's 40 out of 40, it seems Square Enix hoodwinked the critics at the time by filling in the gaps in the story with mounds of optional side content. There's plenty of content in the game with the hunts, optional side quests that reward you for defeating various foes around the world whose bounties you scope out on boards around town, but there are very few memorable side quests in the game. And I feel the amount of time you spend in each city and the lack of downtime with your party to develop those relationships is what keeps me personally from caring about the heroes of Final Fantasy XII as a group. On their own, I don't dislike any of them, but a scene where Balthier regales Vaughn about his adventures as a sky pirate, or Penello's cheery facade breaking down and her having PTSD from her parents dying before the events of the game, could have shown the depth that is written into these characters, but is never shown. That is, unless you read the manga, released only in Japan of course, that supplies the cast with much more personality than is ever seen in the game proper. In one of the interviews, the developers said that they wanted to keep the backstories purposefully vague so that the players could let their imaginations fill in the blanks.
The Viera give little care to goings-on beyond her. But in me, an uneasiness stirred. I had to discover why they had come.
So you came here hoping to find something out and got yourself caught.
Maybe for some people that approach is what they want, but for me that approach resulted in a lack of warmth and connection to the party in this game. So it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game, and it doesn't feel like a Matsuno game. There isn't that same sense of adventure, whimsy, or a mind-bending plot like the best Final Fantasies, and it feels neutered in tone and subject matter when compared to Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics. To me, it doesn't live up to either lineage or forge its own identity. Bloated in the wrong areas and slim in the meaningful ones, I don't like Final Fantasy XII. All of this might have been forgiven if I had liked the gameplay. Like Matsuno's other works, the majority of the game takes place within combat and its systems. In Final Fantasy XII, we see a radical departure from Final Fantasy's previous systems. Less radical if you played Final Fantasy XI, which is what it most closely resembles, but if you were like me and many others that skipped 11 because talking your parents into an MMO subscription model payment plan was as unlikely as your internet connection from Cox Cable working consistently enough to play Final Fantasy XI, then 12's systems had little resemblance to anything you had seen before. 12 instead opts for a real-time system called the ADB, Active Dimension Battle system, that combines real-time MMO-like combat with the ability to pause the action to carry out specific commands. The choice to move to real-time combat with auto-attacking and do away with random encounters was wildly praised as a positive move to modernize the JRPG combat of old, and combined with the Gambit system that allows you to create and order some basic AI subroutines to automate your party is an interesting experiment, and I applaud its ambition. That said, it needs refinement. I was able to get through the game without engaging with the Gambit system very often, and there's a reason we haven't seen this system again. Hiroyuki Ito, designer of the system in the Collector's Edition DVD interview, says that he would go back and refine it if they ever used it again. Tell us about the dramatic move to the Active Dimension Battle system. Looking back, I think it could have been more streamlined. The ADB system is basically the ATB system with some changes in the order certain things are handled. Whether these changes were necessitated by the move to seamless battle or whether ADB could exist without the changes, I can't say. But developing the system felt very similar to developing the ATB system that appeared in Final Fantasy IV. The ATB system as it appeared in Final Fantasy IV was still very rough. I don't think it matured until the iteration used in Final Fantasy V. Similarly, if the ADB system is used again, we can remove elements that weren't needed, and add those it might have been lacking. I can see that this was an important step in the evolution to more satisfying RPG gameplay as seen in future Square Enix games such as Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. but on its own it plays to me like a single-player MMO, and while those super into MMOs might enjoy that type of combat, not counting the truly unique aspect of multiplayer gaming that is absent from Final Fantasy XII like raiding, I don't find the actual experience of playing 12 interesting. The Gambit system combined with the Ogre battle systems paired beautifully in Unicorn Overlord recently, so I'm happy that someone came up with it so it could be used in that game more successfully. To compound my issues with the battle system is the progression system in 12 called the License Board. The Zodiac version revamps this system by corralling your characters into specific jobs. You can eventually unlock a second job board, and with some extra customization afforded by Espers, this lets you create some fairly interesting hybrids. And maybe this is because it's my second time playing through 12 and because I created a very well-rounded party, but I never had to change my playstyle or my gambits for 99% of the game. Which means I, as the player, had no interaction with the combat for the majority of the game. And the arguments from those who enjoy this automated system make it seem like I had to spend hours of tweaking to get my party to that point. And that half of the fun is messing with the gambit system until you find this magical synergy. I hate to disappoint you, or embarrass you, but aside from customizing the percentage of health my party members were at when I needed to use whatever my best cure spell was at the time, and specific status ailment neutralizers, I didn't tweak my gambits at all past the first few minutes of access to the system. Now this might be one of the few issues that the streamlining of the Zodiac Age version presents. In this updated version, you can speed the combat up by 4 times. In the original version, the motivation to optimize your gambits would have primarily come from more efficiently defeating your enemies. But with the option to increase the speed 4 times, those time differences that would have been shaved off with more strategic gambit configurations are so negligible that there is no need to worry about them. One last note about the gameplay. Quickenings, the closest thing this game has to limit breaks, is quite the misnomer for how they work. They are quick-time events, essentially, so in that way the name makes sense, but they are not quick, at least if you're good at them. They chain together and are a great way to do massive damage to bosses while remaining unharmed, because as long as you chain them together and their flashy cutscenes are playing, the enemy can do nothing but get pummeled by Square Enix's dazzling visuals. This is also the only part of gameplay that can't be sped up. I thought about why this is, and it's probably not to give the player maximum time to hit the correct buttons. As they were playing out, I would think, why don't they end when the enemy runs out of HP? This seems to make logical sense and would save so much time. But because if you chain multiple quickenings, you unleash a confluence, an elemental-looking move that hits all enemies surrounding the target of the original quickening, the game can't prematurely end the quickening, because the confluence might still have targets. In the Zodiac Age version, it's the only part of combat that has a drawback, and that drawback is time. Again, ironic given the name. They are so powerful I couldn't help using them on bosses, and yet they brought the gameplay to a boring Simon Says crawl, as I waited patiently for each button prompt as the white light of the last cutscene dissipated. So to summarize, every aspect of the gameplay, while interesting in concept, I found lackluster in execution. I do think, as Ito says, the ADB system needs refinement. And an odd thing I didn't think I would miss is that there is a lack of mini-games in comparison to other Final Fantasies. I made it through the whole game and even the journey to my Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age Platinum Trophy without knowing there was a fishing minigame. Don't worry, I beat that too, and am now King of the River. I don't think I understood the design importance in a JRPG of minigames until I realized one of the things that was missing from 12 was variety. Variety in its plot, variety in its combat, and yes, minigame variety. There was going to be an airship minigame, but it was axed. I don't think an in-game equivalent to Blitzball would have changed my overall opinion of the game, but I think we could have done a lot better than collecting chops.
What's going on?
Graphics and presentation. This is the first non-MMO Final Fantasy with a player-controlled camera. Given the limitations of the PS2, this was truly impressive then. But nowadays, this hasn't aged as well as the directed camera angles of the previous 3D entries. This comes back to a reoccurring theme: variety. The game lacks visual variety, not because the lands you travel aren't varied, but because the way you see them isn't. This combined with the interconnectivity of the zones causes the scale of the world to feel smaller, a side effect of dropping the pre-10 traversable world map. According to the developers, the complexity of the airships were too great and therefore could only be shown in CG cutscenes. The thematic emphasis on the sky seems at odds with the lack of sky exploration. Vaughn wanting to be a sky pirate and Balthier being one, this seems like a sacrifice in order to make the cutscenes more impressive at the cost of the game and story being more cohesive. As mentioned before, there was an airship minigame segment cut according to developers. The only air travel done in the game is from port to port, or fast travel. Final Fantasy X had similar limitations, and yet the locations in that game felt much more memorable. Was this due to the fixed camera angles giving the developers more control, or due to the story spending more time in each town area? The art style of Final Fantasy XII shows this as the next evolutionary step of Vagrant's story. This shouldn't be surprising given that the game shares a lot of the same DNA, as well as from Final Fantasy XI. The character designs and world design are top-notch. Again, the world is harder to appreciate given the way you travel through it, but it's clear a lot of work went into the development of this early period in Ivali's history. The point in Ivali's history when people still had noses, aka before the Great Cataclysm. We see the races added in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance represented in full polygonal glory in more realistic fashion. They are integrated seamlessly to the point where it makes me wonder if not having a Nomu or a Banga in the party was a missed opportunity. It's a good-looking game, and the Zodiac Age version polishes it up from the very aliased PS2 version for modern displays. Music. Another first. This is the first non-MMO Final Fantasy without Nobuo Uematsu. I mean, he did like one song. Hitoshi Sakamoto creates an impressive score, but the volume of tracks created and/or the tone of the game doesn't make for his strongest work. It's missing the bombast and vitality of Final Fantasy Tactics, and the subtlety and atmosphere of his Vagrant story score. Clearly he was going for something different and more generally pleasing because it is a mainline Final Fantasy. He was brought in a little later than you'd think to the project, and in an interesting way. According to newly translated Ultimania interviews, we have some additional insight. Interviewer: let us start with Sakamoto-san first. How did you get involved in the Final Fantasy development? Sakamoto: around June 2003, Matsuno-san, Matsuno Yasumi, invited me out for a drink. And when I went, there were several people from the development team, and they said, please do Final Fantasy XII music. At first, it was a surprisingly casual conversation, but when I asked about the schedule, they said development will be finished in 6 months, so you'll complete all the music by then, and I remember being a little taken aback. Haha, Sakamoto. Before I actually started composing the music, I was very conscious of Nobuo Uematsu-san. I've always loved Final Fantasy, so the impression of Uematsu-san's music remains deep within me. As I was digging through those memories, I wondered, what is good about Final Fantasy music up until now? But getting that kind of feeling and actually composing music are completely different things. After much consideration, I decided that, just like Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, I would keep in mind the Final Fantasy feel, but would try my best to do it in my style. To think Matsuno thought the game would be finished in 6 months back in June of 2003. Optimistic? Or did something happen in the project that completely derailed the original plan? There I go again, getting caught up in the mystery of Matsuno's departure. Overall, I like the music of Final Fantasy XII, but none of it stands out or sticks with me like Sakamoto's previous soundtracks. He's never had the range of Uematsu, and that combined with lack of variety in every other area of this game, this results in a pleasant but forgettable score. It makes me wonder how much of the heavy lifting Nobuo Uematsu was doing musically for the previous Final Fantasies. It's impossible to separate the experience of playing those past Final Fantasies from their music, but I think Post to Uematsu shows a lot of the magic of those games is stored in the sound files. Spoilers! When I accepted that the in-game story wasn't going to be the most interesting aspect of this project, I started researching more into the development to find reasons to justify my lack of interest, alongside any pertinent lore connections to the rest of the Ivalice games, aka the Ivalice Alliance. Final Fantasy XII is the earliest entry on the timeline of Ivalice. The most obvious link is that we see the Lucavi of Final Fantasy Tactics and the Totema of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance rebranded as Espers in Final Fantasy XII. As mentioned in the Vagrant Story episode, how these games are connected and how important their connections are depends on how much you care about Matsuno's view versus Square Enix's. Once we cover Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift, and the Final Fantasy XIV raid Return to Ivalice, I will do a more comprehensive video. Ultimately, its connections to the other Ivalice games that came before it aren't strong enough that you need to play any of the other games before playing this one. The game has some very good twists in the first few hours, with the whole twin revelation being the most beautifully executed. Does the name of the character and the dynamic have anyone else thinking that the writers were influenced by Trigun? I never thought about it until I was reading the manga version and saw this. Also, Ash being the queen and still alive after her alleged suicide, and Rex being Van's brother and living for a year after his stabbing to serve as a convenient witness to pseudo-Bosch's treason, also comes at a nice pace and keeps the player guessing. Then the game stalls out. I didn't need to be in the carousel of constant twists, but once the shock wore off, what were we left with? A bunch of likable characters brought together by circumstance, ragtag, cough cough, Star Wars, fighting an empire. This is the plot of many Final Fantasies, and the flaw of 12 isn't that it repeated this story, but that the characters on this journey remain strangers to us and each other. Since we're in the spoilers section, and I felt like a spoil sport this whole video, let me continue this trend by saying, while the ending wraps up the game nicely, it also leaves me feeling disappointed. The Akuria, a specter race of demigods that has been influencing Ivalice for who knows how long, now recede back into the shadows, I guess. Maybe we'll see them in Revenant Wings. Ash is now the ruler and everybody else goes off on their own way. It's all a little tidy. All the talk of the deeper themes of the game I hear thrown around like, what is duty? What is it to rule? I don't feel like are explored all that much. Give me a post-game campaign where I have to manage Rabanastre from Ash's perspective and manage civilian happiness while being mindful of the royal purse. Give me a story where Bosch questions his duty, because what is duty without choice? If you had the option to choose at dramatic story sections like in Tactics Ogre, whether to be loyal against your own interests versus abandoning your duty for a greater cause, wouldn't that have impacted the player and made them think much more about the greater theme of duty? I've been saying duty too many times in a row, not to smile immaturely now, so time to move to the conclusion. Conclusion. I feel closer to an answer to the question, why don't I like Final Fantasy XII? But I don't feel like I'm all the way there yet. Why do you like or dislike this game? Love or hate? What about it did you find memorable? What would you change about the story? The gameplay? The one-word answer to why I don't like this game is expectations. The multiple-word version is, I expected this game to be something else. The length of development and those involved, and in the end not involved, fueled these expectations and my doubts. What I got was not what I expected, and not what I wanted. Not in the story, not in the characters and how they were portrayed in the game, not in the gameplay, and not in the world. Everything seemed so promising. Everything was so close. I kept waiting for something to click and make it all work. Some hidden mechanic or missed story element. I can't make myself like this game, no matter how hard I try, and I recognize a lot of very talented people put many years of their lives into this game, so I wanted to do my due diligence. The pain I went through to get the Platinum Trophy, as anyone who has achieved it will tell you, should serve as penance for my lack of ability in articulating why this game doesn't work for me. I tried, beat the game, came back for more, and did everything within reason, but no, Final Fantasy XII isn't for me. On the next episode of the Tactical RPG Odyssey, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings. Better luck next time, Sky Pirate. Oh, did I never explain the connection between the serial killer Tsutomu Miyazaki and Final Fantasy XII, as well as the music video for Alien Ant Farm's Smooth Criminal? Oops. Okay, so let's go over the timeline and see the most likely scenario for why Yasumi Matsuno left the project. So the project started, formally announced January 22nd in 2001. Same time, roughly, that they announced the deficit for delaying Final Fantasy X. This caused Hironobu Sakaguchi and the then president to step down. Sakaguchi taking an executive producer type role from there on out, but really not doing a whole lot, aside from just chilling in Hawaii, chilling in Hawaii. So you've got a lot of the core staff starting around here. You've got some of the classics, Hideo Manaba, Akihiko Yoshida, some of these other people I don't know quite as well. Hiroyuki Ito, of course, paired with Yasumi Matsuno, just like Final Fantasy Tactics, so that makes a lot of sense. So then we've got... Okay, so February, just kidding, is when Sakaguchi steps down. Few more people joining the team according to the Ultimanias. Most of this information is from the Ultimanias here, of when they say they joined the team. But interesting note, I was reading an interview with, I believe it was Akihiko Yoshida, or it might have been, what's his face? You know, what's his face? Minagawa. Minagawa was saying that for about 6 months they were talking about just making a smaller game for Play Online, which is, I've read Yasumi Matsuno had a hand in developing the Play Online thing. And they were just talking about making a little game for that, and that turned into Final Fantasy XII, which I assume would have happened, you know, sometime. They said 6 months of talk, so that would have happened sometime after, you know, Vagrant Story was released. I know Manaba was working on Final Fantasy IX as well. He said in the interview that after the international version, which doesn't really make sense on the timeline, because that would have been right here, but anyway. A lot of these interviews, of course, you know, take them with a grain of salt. People are human, all that stuff. And so we've got Final Fantasy: The Spirits of Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within then doesn't do so hot, and so that's one of the big blows to the final blow, some would say, to Hironobu Sakaguchi. Then you've got 10 coming out, doing great, of course. This is when Kamiko Kuryo joins the team here. And then you've got Jun Akiyama, the event director, joining the team in 2002. 2002, there's not a lot of news. This is kind of when they're really tight-lipped, because they're not going to really release any information on Final Fantasy XII until 2003. And that's where the merger happens, so obviously they've got a lot of stuff going on there as well. A few more team members join, then you've got, very important, the classic pairing of Hitachi Sakamoto with our boy Yasumi Matsuno. And so this is where a lot of the key players come in right before we see them do a presentation. So they were working since early 2001, and 2 years later is when we first see the unveiling near the end of the year in 2003. We've got a few different write-ups here. Yasumi Matsuno compares it to the movie Gladiator, which was very popular at the time the game probably started developing. And so he says that there's a darkness, but there's also action. And so people who just want to play games will enjoy it, whereas people familiar with my past games who are looking for that darkness will find hints of that tone throughout. So I think that's a good comparison there. And so this is where we have the first kind of target, which it will fall short of course, where in 2004 in the summer in Japan, 2004 fall in America. And for all the Van haters, all the Vaughn haters, he was there from the beginning publicly. Of course, in the pre-production process, we do have a lot of interviews with people saying that no, the original model was a burly dude, but ultimately they chose this for many reasons. This is when the website goes live as well. And then you've got a few write-ups at the beginning of the year. This one's from the French magazine Joypad here, where they're showing the whole big square team. Sakaguchi looks thrilled. You've got somebody who will play an important factor here. Obviously, you got Aboru Yasumi, and then you've got some sort of, what's the opposite of a black sheep? And then this is right after here, you see the report that Sakaguchi is going independent. So that makes sense. He looks so happy here because he's thinking, oh my goodness, why am I here? We get a few more details here. So this is 2004, mid-2004, the reporting from that same French magazine Joypad is saying Matsuno wants the game to be at least 80% of what he wants in the game and he's going to delay it until that is the fact. So obviously we were shooting for summer. It's summer 2004, and guess what? No game. And so this is when they bring in, according to the Ultimanias, Daisuke Watanabe, who'd worked on a couple different other Square things. Kingdom Hearts, I believe, some other stuff, maybe 10. I'd have to look it up again. But he was working on a lot of stuff, and in the Ultimania and some of the other interviews, he definitely sounds like he's just kind of following through on Matsuno's plan. But when Matsuno departs here in the following year, he names 3 people who he trusts on the core staff, and this guy is not on that list. Maybe it's because he's newer, or maybe because they brought him in to fix what they thought wasn't working and why the game was being delayed. But we also have lots of reports from the early team that they were going between online and offline, and they had a lot of challenges with the system, the PlayStation 2, and making it work with all the systems they were trying to implement. So as we move into 2005, this is where we get the correct, ultimately, due date of the game coming out in North America and Japan here. And from here to here, so mid-2004 to 2005, we don't see Matsuno at any public event here. Not that I can find. If you can find anything that will change up my timeline a little bit, but I've been through countless magazines and interviews and have not seen anything to the contrary. And he definitely wasn't cited anywhere here, because the very next day they announce Kawazu is taking over as executive producer, and they also say that he's stepping down due to Matsuno, that is, health concerns and complications. And so they also kind of scrub the history here, because originally he was at the very least co-director with Ito, and now they refer to him as if he was only ever a producer. And that could be just a translation issue between what producer means in a Japanese context versus how we understand it in the English context and how we use those words. And as referenced here, the connection between Final Fantasy XII and the child killer, serial killer, Tsutomu Miyazaki is the fact that right before the game was about to launch in Japan, in the news, we have the upholding of the death penalty on this child killer. And since there is as he put it in the interview with GameStop in 2006, a scene where Pinello, who has been kidnapped by some characters in the game, at the time, right before the Japanese release, there were various incidents in the real world, which basically there were some similarities there that would have made it a difficult thing to release at the lower age rating that we wanted. So you can look up that scene. It's on YouTube. It's pretty easy to find. But she's all chained up by the bangas. And yeah, I could see why, if you read up even cursorily on this guy, you don't want any association with your game. So the game launches, and then in North America, and then everywhere else. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. So I think we can see a combination of delays, a little over his head, extremely long, difficult development, maybe then bringing in team members that he either didn't get along with, try to change his story. He's kind of described himself as wanting to be a dictator in his games. And before he had a small enough staff, I think he was able to do that. He was able to just kind of create the game he wanted to make with a lot of the core members that he was used to working with, like Yoshida. I actually don't have a picture of the other one. That's interesting. And then you got, obviously Sakamoto and everybody. So that combined with, and I know I'm going, woo, sorry about that, but that combined with Sakaguchi going independent and then scooping up Manaba, I could see why, after such a long, lengthy development, that really kind of killed him. So that is my theory. It's not really a specific theory, I suppose. It's just a culmination of a lot of different factors here. But if we look at the timeline, I think it's pretty easy to see that we're somewhere around 2004 to 2005 Something happened. Something happened big. Or just the weight of everything.